Hey guys, welcome to this week's narrated version of our online presentation. This is an example of one way you can create an online narrated presentation. This is done through the software known as Screencast-O-Matic. You can Google it. Screencast is one word, O-Matic two additional words. If you look it up, it's a free program. It offers you a 15-minute time limit on presentations, but essentially what it does is when you start it, it records everything on your screen and your voice, and then you're able to download that as its own video. Alright, so this week we're looking at cognitive views of learning, behaviorism, and different modes of student motivation. This presentation doesn't contain a ton of detail. It has some examples, but your presentations that you're creating for this week will fill in a lot of the detail for these various concepts related to educational psychology. Alright, so for this demonstration here, this might be an example of a demonstration you could do in your theorist presentation, something related to this. This example, I'd like for you to go ahead and try to read this. Okay. Well, hopefully as you were reading through it, you could find that despite the words being pretty jumbled and mixed up, you can oftentimes figure out what the word is based off of your working memory, your long-term memory of words, being brought back to your working memory by recognizing the first and last letter of each of these words, and then sorting the letters in between within your thinking. So, an example of how our long-term memory and working memory are utilized when we are reading. Different forms of memory. The memory model has three primary forms that are recognized. There's the sensory memory, the working memory, which used to be called short-term memory, and then long-term memory. Sensory memory is something that's very brief. It lasts just for a few seconds. It's basically a copy. So if you see an image or something like that and you close your eyes and you can still see it for a moment, or if there's a bright even flash of light or something like that and you close your eyes and you can still see a spot in your vision, those are considered examples of your sensory memory at work. It only lasts for several seconds. Most of what we see and process just not only through hearing, but our sight, but also hearing, touch, smell, and taste. Those things, most of what it comes through those senses is lost, right? The memories are not recorded. If they do get recorded briefly, it goes into your working memory, and they may be stored there for up to 30 seconds. If they last longer than that, so this is when you're trying to memorize something, and so it's good to try to recall something several minutes later, because if it gets beyond that kind of 30-second window or so, then it goes into what's called long-term memory. Working memory is essentially the memories that we're dealing with when we're thinking. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that working memory is not just a one-way street. Memories don't just go from sensory memory to working to long. They can also go back from your long-term memories to your working memory. Long-term memory is basically a storage for memories that we're not currently thinking about. Of course, they can be stored for a lifetime. Certain things can influence whether you are going to remember things or not. Strong emotions, of course, and other things like that can cause a memory to be very strongly encoded into your long-term memory, but they're stored away. You don't think about them when they're in your long-term memory. If you recall something, though, you say you're taking a test or you recall a memory from a long time ago, that means that memory has come from your long-term memory back into your working memory. Okay, so the working memory is kind of a place where all the memories are processed and they're in our immediate thoughts. Some different considerations for how memory works, and some things that help you retain memories are the meaningfulness of a situation or a particular memory. So if what we're doing is meaningful to us, and that can mean a number of things. It might mean that it was something that we considered to be a lot of fun, something really important, something really sad, something scary. These things can be really strong indications that an experience was meaningful to us. And if something is meaningful, then it's more likely to be retained in a memory. Metacognition is thinking about our thinking. So if we're learning about something or we're experiencing something and we think, wow, that was, pretty cool, or that was, really scary, us stopping to think about the situation or think about our thinking is another strong way to recall and store and process information. This is oftentimes utilized in schools when you're having students read things. If they are reading a text, it's good to have them stop and think about, okay, what questions do I have about this text? Why is this information important? What does this remind me of? So stopping to think about the process that's going on in our head. Why do I keep thinking about this particular thing? Is important to not only processing the information, but also retaining it. And again, both of these ideas have major implications. We want learning to be meaningful. Memorizing facts and things like that is oftentimes not very meaningful, so we tend to forget them. Whereas doing a engaging science lab is going to be pretty meaningful to students. So between these two processes, these are things for instructors to keep in mind, to utilize in order to ensure that our students are retaining what they're learning in school. Again, some essential cognitive processes, the human memory model, some additional thoughts on that. Stress and trauma can increase memories if it's something scary, but then also oftentimes if it's really a prolonged amount of time that goes on, we may not remember what happened very clearly at all. Oftentimes people in car accidents don't remember or have a clear memory, or very different versions of what happened in that. Not only because of personal bias and interest, but also because when something like a traumatic happens, there's a release of adrenaline, and that can shut down our memory retention areas. And so those sort of things can greatly affect whether or not we remember things, as well as biological factors. If there's lead in a child's drinking water, then they're going to have less memory formation. Genetics, of course, can affect those things. And the way that our environment affects our genetics is also probably the most important thing. The genes, it's been shown, the genes that are responsible for higher scores on tests and things like that tend to lead to stronger memories being formed or suppressed by lead being in drinking water and things like that. So it's not necessarily somebody has particularly better genetics for that, but it's the way our genetics are affected by our environment. It's a complex interplay between the two. Different ways in which we pay attention to things, how technology influences that, difference in the way we perceive events, how memories are actually formed through encoding and forgetting, and then again, metacognition and versus our unconscious processing are all important concepts to consider when we're thinking about the importance of memory and learning. And these are all topics that you look at through your projects for this week. Behaviorism is a large school of psychological thought, probably the most dominant one in schools today. It got going in the early 1900s, even maybe late 1800s, but early 1900s, particularly with these individuals or theorists listed here: Ed Thorndike, John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, the infamous dog experiments with salivation and ringing the bell, and then B.F. Skinner, who did a lot of work in the 1950s and 60s, looking at how to influence people's behavior, what determines our behavior. Behaviorism is a very focused study that looks at how our behaviors manifest, how they indicate what we're thinking, and how they can be influenced. All of those theories listed there may be important to know about for your licensure exam. So you will want to polish up on them, but know that they are all big researchers within the area of behaviorism, right? And again, this is the dominant form in schools, the way we manage students or try to manage students' behavior, giving out rewards and punishments. These are all based within behaviorism, as well as giving tests and grades and things like that. Those are also based in behaviorism because achieving well on a test is actually a form of behavior. We're looking for somebody to get correct responses. We're looking for a particular behavior, and we do things to try to influence and increase the correct responses and decrease the incorrect responses. So those are all components of behaviorism. So it's really throughout our schools, and it's really the dominant paradigm for you to consider and to think about. Not necessarily the best one, but it does have certain strengths, and again, it's the world that we live in schools today. When we look at behaviorism, conditioning is a major component of this. So how do we encourage or discourage people's behavior based on external stimuli? So things that happen in our environment change the way we behave, right? There's the classical conditioning, this Pavlov's experiment with the dogs, and the group that is looking at that will hopefully fill us in with a little more detail about classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is what B.F. Skinner worked on a lot. And deals with reinforcement and punishment. Just in a nutshell, reinforcement is looking to increase a behavior we want to see. We want to see students do better on tests. We want to see students stay in their seats during instructional time. We want to see students being nice to each other on the playground or during an activity. We do reinforcement. We use positive reinforcement, but then also negative reinforcement. We might take away something if students don't, we see an increase, or if that desirable behavior decreases. Punishment is looking to decrease an undesirable behavior, right? So if somebody is doing something hurtful towards another, we will tend to punish them in the hopes that they will avoid that behavior in the future. Some examples of behaviorism in schools, and you may have seen a lot of these sort of things in schools during your own time, or if you've been working in schools. Behavior charts, different classroom management things that look to increase students' positive behaviors, giving out positive behavior tickets, behavior charts and things like that are all major and common components of looking at how we manage students' behaviors, beyond the idea of tests and grades, which are also behaviorism, but these are the kind of more overt examples of behaviorism being applied within schools today. Social cognitive theory is like behaviorism because it looks at how our environment, the stimuli, affect our behavior, but it also recognizes a little more of the agency within people, so that our behavior can also affect our environment. It also draws quite a bit off of Lev Vygotsky's ideas about socially situated learning, but it also deals with how we may learn just by watching others and imitating them. And it relies a lot on us learning to regulate our own behaviors. Again, this is another topic for presentations this week. Motivation, how do we learn, is oftentimes determined by how motivated we are to learn, right? There's extrinsic and external motivation. Behaviorism relies on that. But then there's also intrinsic forms of motivation where we do something because we feel it is the right thing to do. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of course, is very key and fundamental to our how motivated we are to do something. If we haven't met our basic needs, then it's hard to be motivated to do higher level thinking and tasks and things like that in school. So if a student is hungry, they probably won't do well during math class, right? So meeting those needs first before we move on to the next is key within that, and that's Maslow's hierarchy. That's another important one. We're about out of time here, but if you read over the requirements for your presentations, this is, like I said, a good example of what, maybe not a good example, but it's an example of what's expected for these presentations. Of course, if you have any questions about them, let me know. Thank you.